So I have been talking about representation as, and one of the examples that I've been using, and I have been using for quite some time in my work, and one of the sets that becomes embedded in a lot of different groups of sorting in the many sets that I work with. And it's been used in music set lists and titles for narratives that emerge as music set lists, and it's been used in other sets that I've created as well. So, in one example is the music set list, and I still haven't named this long rambling sentence that I'm expressing right now. I still haven't named the example, but one of the music set lists that use this example is a set list called A Portrait of the Mystic as a Young Man, which later became A Portrait of the Mystic at 55. And the reason that it became A Portrait of the Mystic at 55 is various, but relates to the EE in the specific theater that I have, the Alfred E.E. Neumann theater experience. And as my close readers will be aware, that EE refers to E.E. Cummings. And also because 55 is a Fibonacci number, and it was I turned 55 when I changed the title of that playlist. And also because 55 relates to the figure of Fiver. And the figure of Fiver is seen here. This is the one of the main characters, not necessarily the protagonist. The protagonist may or may not be either Fiver or Hazel, but it comes from Richard Adams' children's book, A Watership Down. And the as that I'm referring to in the as of representation, that all of this preamble has deferred, is James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, obviously. So what I wanted to do with a new series or a new set of work that bears upon many of these sets and subsets that I've discussed with this rambling preamble. And again, close readers will will remember that rambling preambles have to do with one of the definitions of displacements, right? So I'll let you search and hunt for that. But the ramble is not the shortest distance between 2 points. And in fact, I'm not entirely sure that the future of physics will ever entirely believe in the shortest distance between 2 points. But in any case, the tesseract that I'm creating here involves a rethinking of that as in representation, and the first turn that I want to make in regarding that as in representation, the portrait of the artist as a young man, is I want to do a series of work in which I look at a portrait of the young man as an artist. And so in order to do this, I want to look at some of my experiences of art making, and some of the ways that my art making evolved out of both abilities and limitations that I had as a young man and continue to have, and how that way of art making has become a material process in space and time, and how it's developed into a kind of way of organizing experience. And then eventually I want to tie this to a series that I have yet to begin, but want to begin, that involve the way that I work and looking at the way that I work, and specifically related to my understanding of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And this is sort of an aside for this piece, but will become relevant later when I begin this series. But when I was in school, in college, at UCSD, one of the older, I hesitate, to use the word, but we would say sort of, well, okay, the euphemism will be this. He belonged to the new critical school of interpretation. So it was, a distant theoretical position even at that time, at least for me, but not for him. But one of the teachers, professors there, Roy Harvey Pierce, had written this essay about Whitman, referring to the 1855 version of the Leaves of Grass as the I don't know what word to use, the best version of Leaves of Grass. It was a aesthetic judgment sort of take on it, and he had an argument, and I'm sure it was very reasonable from a new critical standpoint, and how this work, held together and congealed and wasn't filled with all this dross, and wasn't filled with studies and sketches that weren't fully realized, right? So it was tidy, and it was concise, and he had this argument. But my whole understanding of Leaves of Grass, part of what made it great was that it was this one work, that this artist did, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was a very different way of thinking about the book than if you wrote this book and then you had it published and then you sent it out into the world and it never changed. And so, Whitman's Leaves of Grass for me was almost a living thing. It grew, it was alive, and it was alive in the same way that grass is. It was a rhizome, and yeah, I agree with Roy Harvey Pierce in a certain sense. Like, some of the late poems aren't as great as they don't have that that energy, that not only intellectual energy and artistic energy, but they have a kind of wearing out. But we get old, right? And even that, even the processes of our disintegration are part of our life, So I've profoundly disagreed with the reading and even the premise that there was a better or a worse, because for me it wasn't a better or a worse, it was a process. And I like to look at it in space and time. And when I fully realized my relationship to that work, I became conscious that that's the way that I was going to work in one way or another. Now, it didn't necessarily have to be just one book, but I wanted to return again and again to work that I had done, and I wanted to rewrite, and I wanted the process to be there, and I didn't want these discrete segments. And Whitman didn't have a thing with sets and subsets, but in a lot of ways, his divisions of the book and the way that the divisions or chapters or whatever one wanted to call them of Leaves of Grass spoke to one another and didn't speak to one another too. I found it useful, and he never explores the relationship of that rhizome to other rhizomes, like labyrinthine rhizomes or the echoes of caves or things like that, but he could have, and I thought, well, I'll consciously do all of these things. Anyway, that is going to be in the background of what I want to talk about today, and we'll just leave it sort of in the background, and bring it, more closely into bear with whatever emerges from this series, a portrait of the young man as an artist. But today I want to talk about one, early grade school piece that I created, and how it, grew out of limitations that I have and abilities that I have, but how the abilities and the limitations are often, one and the same thing. And so I'll create this piece as a storytelling of an event that actually happened, but also as a metaphor for a way of thinking about art making. All right, so when I was in grade school, and this must have been about perhaps third grade, art making was sectioned as part of the learning experience in school, but not on a daily basis. So it was already somewhat limited. So for example, we read every day, we had reading lessons, and we did math work every day. And I can't exactly remember how often we did science. It may have been on a weekly basis. But art wasn't really, at least in the general classroom. Maybe in special education, it was more integrated. In fact, I know that it was more integrated in the special education program that I belonged to, and that in the construction of these large projects that we did, there was always an aesthetic element, and always an artistic element, and always a constructivist element: constructing, making, creating, building, crafting. And but in the regular classroom, it was set apart from the rest of the work. So you didn't integrate, your reading or your literature or your math with your creativity. It was a different thing. And viewers of my work will realize that there's a lot of boundary ambiguity between these disciplines for me, and sometimes so much ambiguity of those boundaries that people fail to realize that what I do is art, or that I consider it art, at least. And so it was already a different experience for me than what I would have imagined art is. So very confined. So let's imagine something confined. So I'm going to try to hold the camera very still and put fiber. I'm imagining this is an image of fiber. It could be hazel, but I'm going to call it fiber. So try to hold this very still and keep him in a hutch. Right? He's not free. He's not a wild rabbit anymore. He's contained. He's circumscribed by the hour that he is given on a Friday, maybe because it's Friday today, for art in his grade school class. All right. Okay. So now we'll let him go free again. All right. So this was a different way of making than I had envisioned, for myself. And when I did art making at home, I did this same kind of thing that I do now. I brought math into it. I brought other experiences into it. I brought my understanding of literature into it. So that's the context for the making. And then the assignment for the making was, we were going to build these animals out of, chicken wire. And we had, our materials were chicken wire and starch and, newspaper and then paint. And then so you create the structure of you choose what animal you want to make. So you're going to choose an animal, and then you're going to make that animal, build it, construct it, form it, shape something that mimetically resembles whatever the animal is. In my case, it was going to be a rabbit, and then you take the newspaper, you cut it into strips, and you dip it into the starch, and you cover this formal construct to hide the holes and the material itself with this newspaper material that eventually hardens. And then you take your paint and you color it so that it resembles the animal that you're constructing. So it was the assignment was pretty well defined, and you could think of it as like constraints, right? Like the way that when David Anton said, create a self-portrait as a sandwich. You could think of that as a constraint. And so, I didn't probably really fully understand the idea of a poetic or artistic constraint when I was in the third grade. But, basically I got the rules, right? You could think of it also as a set of rules, like for building. Okay, so one of the rules is it's an animal, so you have a choice. So, like, this would be, imagine if Aaron, right, had a choice, right? We talked about like how Harold Cohen constructed Aaron, and the rules that were provided for Aaron were very much like a set of constraints, but the rules were rules for drawing and what drawing was. But imagine that instead of being given the assignment, that Aaron had a choice. Like, what do you want to draw today, Aaron? And would he choose an animal? Would he choose a letter? Would he choose a relationship? What would he choose? And eventually, in the long-term discussion over decades that Harold Cohen and I had intermittently, I saw that some of these questions were becoming relevant for him as well, even though that when I initiated them it was very tongue-in-cheek. But Harold also became concerned with this idea of choice and certain what would we say, epistemological ramifications of the idea of choosing and the idea of selection in the creative process. So imagine that Aaron had a choice, and you say, well, what do you want to build with your chicken wire? Let's just say that the material you don't have much choice over, because we all have limited resources, right? Even those of us who have an abundance of resources have limited resources. Let's use the authoritarian ex-president Donald Trump, for example. So Trump has extraordinary monetary resources compared to most of us, right? But like very limited intellectual resources at his disposal, and very little comprehension of history and no comprehension of art making whatsoever, right? Like absolutely, like he's what we used to, well, let's just say this word fits, right? Like he's a Philistine, right? He has no appreciation of anything of aesthetic value. He has no aesthetic taste whatsoever. It comes out of a cookie cutter or cardboard box. His favorite meal is McDonald's. Gold is better than anything, and it doesn't matter what it's shaped into. So, all of our resources are limited, and so let's say that the resources are just a given. But if Aaron were asked, what he would like to, the choice, it didn't have to do with the resources, but had to do with the form or the idea. What would he like to make? Well, he may or may not have chosen a rabbit, and he may or may not have chosen an animal. And my argument always was that he wouldn't. But given the constraint, I selected a rabbit. Now, the reason that I selected a rabbit initially was simply because I knew that I had limitations in my formal abilities in making art. And I love art, and I have always considered myself an artist, even though I'm a terrible craftsman. So how is that going to work? It was always going to be a problem, but it was always going to be an advantage too, in a certain way. And I'll try to demonstrate that today. So the reason that I chose a rabbit is because, as you see here, it has this big abdomen that's basically round, right? And I figured I could do that with my chicken wire, and then he has this relatively easy to figure out skull structure, and just a couple of big lob ears. Now the difficult part is, and here they're hidden, right? The difficult part is the legs. And so I knew I had to address that, And having selected a rabbit, I thought about Fiverr, and from Watership Down, and he was going to be my portrait subject. So this gave me all kinds of opportunity to use Fiverr as an excuse to create a narrative that justified some of the simplifications that I made. And so the first thing that I knew that I needed to do was I needed to justify the way that I wasn't going to be able to produce his legs, right? So I figured I could do that narratively, and I could title the piece, If Fiverr Couldn't Leave the Warren. And if you know the story, you know that Fiverr is he's a visionary, and he has this vision. He's sort of a prophetic rabbit, and he has this vision of the destruction of the Warren, and this inspires him, to warn the community and let them know that they have to leave and they have to migrate to a different territory and build a new warren. And some of the rabbits, including his brother, Hazel, listen to him, and some of them don't. And the ones that stay behind are largely, destroyed by this human development that levels their territory. And the ones that do listen to him, go on this adventure, and it's a kind of exodus and a kind of definitely. That's Leo sneezing in the background. God bless you, Leo. And it's a kind of exodus, and it definitely has metaphorical links and connections to books of Genesis and other stories of great migrations and salvations and buildings of communities. you know, and in some ways, you know, relates to, you know, perhaps the Aeneid and other tales as well. So this is the story, the backstory behind the character Fiverr, and then you know, somehow like the rudimentary form that, you know, his legs would take, or this sense of his immobility in them, you know, abstracting them in a way that because there could be other images of Fiverr, right, in which his dynamic nature, his ability to move, was emphasized with using an articulation of his legs. But like being stuck here in this rudimentary form, you know, I thought we could say if Fiverr couldn't leave the Warren, and so I constructed this image, and then we were supposed to paint it, right? Well, so the manner of my title, the title grew out of the constraints of my ability, right? The choice grew out of the constraints of my ability, and then I developed a story around those constraints that I thought was interesting. So a narrative. So I built a narrative out of my limitations in a certain sense, and so so having done so, I was committed to that. I was committed to that narrative, and then when we get to the point where we're going to paint the I should also mention that you know, it was going to take me longer to build this construct than it was going to take a lot of the other students, you know, in the art sessions who were better at this kind of craft, right? So my rabbit was slow. In a sense, he was late, and I could have taken that as the starting point, right? He could have been the late rabbit, you know, looking at his watch. He could have been something from Alice in Wonderland, but he wasn't. He was Fiverr. So having committed myself to that narrative, and Fiverr, if Fiverr hadn't been able to leave the Warren, then I further committed, you know, myself to this idea of Fiverr as the prophet. And so when it came time to paint the image, instead of doing that, what I had done was I had spent a lot of time looking at the newspaper that was going to construct the body of my rabbit. And the other art students didn't do that. They very quickly went through these pages of newsprint and cut them into strips and applied them to their craft making. And because they were going to paint over these clippings, they were the stories that they chose were of no consequence. But I didn't do that. As early as the second grade, you know, we were learning about the Earth, and the moon landing was a big thing in 69 and 70, and NASA was a thing, and Earth Day was a thing, and you know, we were aware of the toll that auto emissions and industry was taking on our environment in terms of pollution. And soon, you know, I think, you know, either by the time that I made this rabbit or shortly after, there was the gas crisis, in which, you know, you were assigned an odd or an even day based on your license plate. You could only buy gas on certain days, and there were a lot of things going on that, you know, seemed to me in our society in the early 70s that were similar to and probably why that one of the the movies, the early movies of Watership Down, was made at that time because of the connections, right? So it seemed to me like that Fiverr the Prophet had a lot to say. So I could use these newspapers as a way of giving voice to Fiverr's environmentalism, and so I chose pieces from the newspaper that seemed relevant to me in this dimension, or in this semantic field. And so he was already very much like this image. He was, in fact, even more than this image, because this image it uses simply text from Watership Down. And what I was trying to do was to create an analogy between the crisis that Fiverr warned against and our own crisis. So my Fiverr, had this discourse that he was built out of, and he was very rudimentary. And then I didn't paint him, and it took me forever to cut out. Most of the students were done with their creatures before I had even finished cutting out my the proper strips from the newspapers that I wanted. But it took me forever to do that. But when I was finished, I refused to paint him, and my regular grade school teacher looked at the thing, and it wasn't pretty, and it wasn't painted, and it had violated at least one of the constraints, right, or one of the rules for the making, which was you paint the thing. Well, I didn't, or I did in a way, but I did so with words. I painted it with words and with ideas and with news, and it wasn't right. It wasn't acceptable. It wasn't what was asked. Just like some of my solutions to finding ways of staying in college weren't inside the law or the rules, right? And I fortunately wasn't entirely held accountable for it, because I guess I was good at finding ways of cheating, right? And so you could say that my Fiverr cheated, if Fiverr weren't able to leave the warrant, which was the piece's title. Now, other people, my fellow students, didn't have titles like that. They had titles like Elephant, or if they even had titles. I'm not sure they necessarily had titles, but if you asked, what is it, they would say, it's a. So if you asked them what it was, they would say, it's a dog, or it's an elephant. They wouldn't say it's an elephant as. Do you see my point? They wouldn't say it's an elephant as a Republican, or they wouldn't say it's a Democrat as a donkey, or they wouldn't say it's a work of literature as a fox, or they wouldn't say it's a trickster as a coyote. They would just say it's a coyote. But even though my Fiverr, if Fiverr weren't able to leave the warrant, even though there's no as there, there's an implicit as, isn't there? It's Fiverr as a creature incapacitated to move, right? Isn't it? Because Fiverr's warning depended upon the stability and mobility of the group to travel. But what if he weren't able to travel? What if either some damage had been done to his legs, or he was scared? Maybe the hidden legs weren't that he was physically disabled or damaged, but that he was incapacitated due to fear. And Fiver was very much afraid. So for Fiver to have amassed the courage, to tell his fellow rabbits, beginning with his brother Hazel, of this was already an issue, and then they were low on the totem pole. Fiver also appealed to me because Fiver was named Fiver because he was the fifth in a, I don't know what the word is, but litter of rabbits. And these rabbits in Watership Down could only count to 5. So Fiver was like saying like the last one. Like that's what his name meant. Like, he like Fiver to infinity, right? Because there was no word beyond 5 in rabbit or Lapin language. And so this appealed to me because I also had, counting issues because of my dysgraphia that has dyscalculia issues involved in it. And Fiver, who was a visionary, was also like the runt. And so I already thought of like the connection between a sort of limitation or disabled one and a sort of super abled one, like the balance of those, two very different kinds of irregularity or non-normativity, right? One that like clearly has a value even though it may not be recognized, and one that is clearly like disparaged by the culture. So all that was there, and then with my if was like an as, if for Fiver, Fiver as someone who couldn't leave the Warren, and then the newspaper articles described, what the result of not being able to leave the Warren would be, right? If we don't change, if we don't make corrections, if we don't respond, then we are, destruction is inevitable, right? So we have to overcome our fear and find a way of moving. If Fiver hadn't been able to leave the Warren, right? So then, and then this is where I guess I'm coming back to the suggestion that I made about my work, consciously taking on this quality that I saw in Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass as being a kind of rhizome and living and alive, and it grows and it develops, and you never really leave anything behind. So years later, when I had begun a project, it was not really something that I chose to do, but it was something that grew out of the environment that I was in. But I was on the Navajo Nation, and I had begun a project of rescuing dogs. And it wasn't that I went out looking for dogs to rescue, but the dogs I rescued were just dogs that were in my path, right? So the first one was a young adolescent, female sheepdog that I found on the road. She was in the middle of the highway, and she had a number of injuries, and she had heat exhaustion, and she was dying of malnutrition, and she had some kind of parasite equivalent to something like scabies, and she had, an injured foot. Anyway, on and on. Anyway, she's the first one, and then there were several, and I found another one, who wasn't in the middle of the highway. I thought he was, dead, and I had kept a shovel in my vehicle because I would come across, animals that had been dogs that had been hit, by cars, and and I would bury them. And so I thought that this was another example of that, and I took out my shovel and got ready to bury him, and then he lifted his head up, and he was still alive. And it turned out that he'd been hit by a car, and he'd been left for dead, but he was still alive. So I engineered. I had some. I had to return home, and then I engineered some. I was afraid that his back was broken, and it turned out later, that he was in fact paralyzed on his left side, but a lot of that came back, through work I did with him, moving his limbs around and giving him exercises to do. But I was really worried that his back was broken, and then that moving him would only make matters worse. So I got some cardboard and I made a little board, carrying board for him, and I got him on this board and took him home, and eventually, I couldn't save his front leg. It was too damaged, and the vet, had to remove that leg, and then the back leg had, the bones in the back leg had been shattered, but the vet was able to construct what's like a soft hip out of muscle tissue, and so his left back leg was salvageable, but he still limps on it. But when I found him, he couldn't move. He couldn't even stand up to urinate or anything else. And so it took a long time, but eventually, I taught him how to stand up, and I taught him how to, and then he's, was accepted into the pack by the alpha female, and had several surgeries, but he lost his front leg, and anyway, I knew his name would be Fiverr.